It might seem like some colors have always belonged to boys and others to girls, but that's not really true. This idea of gendered colors is pretty new. It really only started to stick in the last 100 years or so. Before that, colors weren't assigned genders like they are today. People just didn't think that way about blue or pink or any other color. For a long time, babies and young children simply wore white. This was a very common practice. You can see it in old photographs. Most young children are dressed in white. There were good reasons for this. White fabric was practical. It was easy to clean, people could bleach white clothes. This bleach made them look fresh and new again. This was important because babies get dirty a lot. They spit up, they have accidents, white clothes were simple to wash and keep clean. These dyes were also not as good back then. Colors could run when you washed them. This would ruin other clothes. Or the colors would fade quickly. White fabric didn't have these problems. It stayed white. It didn't fade. It didn't bleed onto other garments. So white was a practical choice for clothing that needed frequent washing. Also, clothes were expensive. People often made clothes at home, or they bought them to last. Children's clothes were often hand-me-downs. A white gown could be passed from one child to the next. It didn't matter if the next child was a boy or a girl. The color didn't suggest a gender. This made the clothes more versatile. Families could use them for many children. This saved money. It made things simpler. Children's fashion was also different. There wasn't a huge market for specific baby clothes like there is today. Children often wore smaller versions of adult clothes. Boys and girls wore similar styles. They both wore dresses for a while. This was also for practical reasons. It was easier to change diapers under a dress. It made potty training simpler too. So the focus was on practicality and cost, not on what color suggested what gender. The idea of pink for girls and blue for boys simply didn't exist. Parents didn't pick out baby clothes based on these color rules. They picked clothes based on what was available. They chose what was affordable. They chose what was easy to care for. The concept of a color being inherently masculine or feminine was not a widespread cultural norm. It just wasn't part of how people thought about babies or children. Colors like red, blue, green, and yellow were used in adult clothing. But they didn't have strict gender meanings. A man could wear blue. A woman could wear blue. It was just a color. There was no deep meaning attached to it in terms of gender identity. So when we look back at history, we see a lot of freedom with color. We see a lot of practicality driving clothing choices. The clear divide we know today is a modern invention. It's something that developed over time. It shows how our ideas about gender and fashion can change a lot. This historical context helps us understand why the idea of pink being for boys might sound strange now. But it makes more sense when you realize that all gendered colors are quite new. They aren't old traditions, they are products of the 20th century. People used to care more about function than about gender coding a child with a specific color. They just wanted clothes that worked, they wanted clothes that lasted, and white did a very good job of that for a long, long time. So, the idea of assigning any color, including pink, to a specific gender simply wasn't on people's minds. The modern system is very different. The 20th century started to bring changes. People began to think more about specific clothes for children. The idea of separate clothing for boys and girls started to grow. This is when colors like pink and blue began to be talked about. But their meanings were not fixed. They often flipped. They weren't what we expect today. Stores and magazines in the early 1900s started to give advice. They told parents what colors to use for their babies. And sometimes this advice suggested pink for boys. They suggested blue for girls. This sounds backwards to us now, but it made sense to some people at the time. Why would they suggest pink for boys? Well, think about red. Red was often seen as a strong color. It was a bold color. It was a color associated with men and soldiers. Pink is a lighter version of red. And so, some people thought pink was a strong, more decisive color. It was like a little red. This made it suitable for boys. It had a masculine feel. It wasn't considered delicate. It was seen as vibrant. And why blue for girls? Blue was often seen as a softer color. It was daintier. People sometimes linked blue to the Virgin Mary. She was often shown wearing blue in art. This gave blue a gentle, serene quality. These qualities were thought to be feminine. So, blue was suggested for girls. It was a calming color. It was graceful. So, for a brief period, you might find articles or advertisements telling parents to dress their boy in pink and to dress their girl in blue. For example, a 1918 Ladies' Home Journal piece had a section on what colors meant. It said that pink, being a stronger color, was for boys. Blue, being more delicate, was for girls. Another catalog from 1918, published by Best & Co., also suggested pink for boys. It said pink was more decided and stronger, but it's important to remember this was just advice. It wasn't a strict rule, not everyone followed it. Many parents probably didn't even know about these suggestions. They bought what they liked, they bought what was available, they bought what was affordable. The system wasn't rigid, it was still very fluid. There wasn't a huge amount of brightly colored baby clothes anyway. White was still very common. But when colors did appear, these ideas popped up. It was a time of experimentation. Companies were trying to create new trends, they were trying to sell more specific items. So they came up with reasons for parents to buy certain colors. The early 20th century was also a time when gender roles were changing. The society was becoming more complex. There was a growing interest in how to raise children. Experts offered advice on many things, including clothing. These ideas about pink and blue were part of that larger trend. They were attempts to define and categorize. However, the specific suggestions for pink for boys and blue for girls never really took hold completely. It was a minor trend. It was a suggestion that faded. It didn't become a universal rule. It was more like a fleeting fashion idea. Most people probably didn't even notice it. Or they ignored it. So, while it is true that some sources suggested pink for boys, it was a limited idea. It was not a widespread cultural norm. It was a moment in time when colors were being tentatively assigned. But the assignments were not firm. They were not universally accepted. The meanings of colors were still very much up for grabs. They had not yet settled into the strong gender associations we know today. The shift was still going to happen. The final assignment of pink to girls and blue to boys was still a few decades away. This early period was just a step in that longer journey. It shows that things can change a lot. What seems fixed today was once very open. The true turning point for gendered colors came later. It happened around World War II and in the years right after. This was a time of huge change in society. It also led to big changes in how children's clothing was sold and seen. This is when pink really started to become a girl's color. Blue became firmly linked to boys. After World War II, many things shifted. There was an economic boom. More people had money to spend. Consumerism grew, stores got bigger, they started to sell more kinds of products. Companies wanted to sell more clothes. They wanted to sell more toys. To do this, they needed to make products specific to certain groups. Children became a big target group. This meant making clothes and toys just for boys. And clothes and toys just for girls. Companies found it profitable to divide the market. If parents had a boy, they'd buy boy things. If they had a girl, they'd buy girl things. This encouraged more buying. It meant parents might buy two different sets of items if they had children of different genders. The gender roles in society were also very strong after the war. Men were often seen as the breadwinners. Women were often seen as homemakers. This idea of separate but equal roles extended to children. Boys were encouraged to be strong and active. Girls were encouraged to be gentle and nurturing. Clothes reflected this. Pink became strongly associated with girls during this time. It was seen as pretty. It was seen as soft. It was seen as delicate. These were all qualities that society often attributed to women and girls. Pink became the color of beauty and gentleness. It was a stark contrast to the earlier idea of pink as a strong color for boys. The meaning of the color changed, the culture around it changed. Blue, on the other hand, became the dominant color for boys. It was seen as strong. It was seen as steady. It was seen as a color of stability. These were qualities linked to masculinity. Boys were dressed in blue. It was seen as a serious color. It was a work color. It was a color for those who would eventually go out and provide. No one can point to one exact moment when this shift happened. It wasn't a sudden decision. It was a gradual process. It was driven by many factors. Magazines played a role. The advertisements played a role. Department stores played a role. They all started to push these color ideas. They showed girls in pink. They showed boys in blue. This slowly built up a new cultural norm. Think about how a store might arrange clothes. They would have a girl section. It would be full of pinks, purples, and pastels. They would have a boys section. It would be full of blues, greens, and darker tones. This visual separation made the gendered colors feel natural. It made them feel like the only choice. This post-war period really solidified the gender binary. Everything was categorized into either boy or girl, and colors were a big part of that categorization. As parents began to expect these colors, they looked for them. If they were having a girl, they would buy pink. If they were having a boy, they would buy blue. The freedom of earlier times slowly disappeared. The flexibility was gone. The shift wasn't just about clothes, it was about toys too. Pink toys for girls, blue toys for boys. The entire children's market became highly gendered. This meant that by the 1950s and 60s, the idea of pink for girls and blue for boys was pretty well established. It was just how things were. The earlier suggestions of pink for boys were largely forgotten. They were just a curious footnote in history. The new order was firmly in place. This strong cultural programming made it hard to imagine things being any other way. The gendered color rules became really strong, but there was a small period in the 1970s when things started to loosen up a bit. People began to question traditional gender roles. There was a move towards more unisex clothing. This was for both adults and children. Parents in the 1970s sometimes chose more neutral colors. They wanted clothes that weren't so clearly for boys or girls. Yellow, green, and orange became popular for babies. These colors worked for anyone. This was practical. It made hand-me-downs easier again. It was a rejection of the strict pink and blue divide. People were looking for less rigid ways to dress their kids. They wanted to move beyond the strong gender messages, but this trend didn't last forever. The 1980s saw a big shift back, and this time the gendered colors became even more fixed. They became more intense. There were a few reasons for this. One big reason was the rise of ultrasound technology. Ultrasounds became more common. They allowed parents to know the sex of their baby before birth. This was a huge change. Before, parents often waited until the baby was born to know if it was a boy or a girl. They bought neutral clothes. Then they would buy specific items after the birth. Now, parents could find out early. This created a new market. Companies saw an opportunity. They started to sell things specifically for boys or girls even before the baby arrived. They pushed gender reveal parties. They sold "it's a boy" or "it's a girl" merchandise. And with this, the colors came back with a vengeance. Knowing the sex beforehand made parents want to decorate the nursery. They wanted to buy specific clothing, they wanted to buy gender-specific toys, and what colors did they use? For pink for girls, blue for boys. These colors became the default. They became the expectation. Stores fueled this trend. They had aisles full of pink things, they had aisles full of blue things. They made it hard to find neutral options. If you wanted to buy a baby gift, it felt like you had to choose. Was it a pink gift or a blue gift? The options were everywhere. The message was clear. This period solidified the pink for girls, blue for boys rule more than ever before. It wasn't just a suggestion anymore, it was almost a command. It became deeply ingrained in our culture. Children's sections in stores were clearly divided. Clothing styles were very different for boys and girls. The message was constant. The 1980s and 1990s saw this continue. Children grew up seeing these color rules everywhere. They learned them from a young age. It became natural to think that pink is a girl's color, and blue is a boy's color. It felt like it had always been that way. But as we know, it hadn't. This strong gendering of colors had an impact. It limited choices, it put pressure on parents. It also reinforced very traditional ideas about gender. It told children what colors they were supposed to like. It told them what roles they were supposed to play. The brief moment of gender neutrality in the 70s was largely forgotten. The divide was deeper than ever. This period created the strict color rules that many of us grew up with. It made it seem like there was no other way. Today we see things changing again. The very strict rules about pink for girls and blue for boys are being questioned. More and more people are challenging these old ideas. They are pushing back against the strong gender stereotypes. Society is becoming more open. People are talking more about gender identity, they are talking about gender expression. This includes how we dress and the colors we choose. Many parents today want to raise their children without these rigid color rules. They want their kids to feel free to like any color. You can see this happening in different ways. Some clothing brands are now making gender-neutral clothes. They offer baby clothes in yellow, green, white, or even patterns that don't lean one way or the other. These clothes are for all babies. They don't try to sort kids into gender boxes using color. This gives parents more choices. Celebrities and public figures also play a role. Some choose to dress their children in clothes that break the pink-blue mold. They might dress a boy in pink. They might dress a girl in blue, or they might choose other colors entirely. This helps show that colors are just colors. They don't have to mean one specific gender. It helps normalize different choices. There's a growing understanding that interests and preferences are not tied to gender. A girl might love blue. A boy might love pink. And that's perfectly fine. These are just personal preferences. They don't say anything about someone's gender or who they are. However, the pink-blue divide is still very strong in many places. You still walk into most toy stores or baby clothes sections, and the colors are very segregated. It's hard to ignore. The cultural message is still powerful. It will take time for these deeply set ideas to fully change. But the conversation is happening. People are more aware. They are asking why we stick to these rules. They are realizing that many of these traditions are not old at all. They are quite new. They were created by market forces and cultural shifts, not by ancient wisdom. The history of pink and blue shows how culture can shape our thinking. It shows that what we think of as fixed and natural can actually change a lot over time. Pink was once suggested for boys. Then it became firmly for girls. Now many hope it will just be a color for everyone. This shift is about more than just colors. It's about letting children be themselves. It's about letting them explore their interests without limits. It's about creating a more inclusive world. A world where a color doesn't define who you are or what you can do. So, to answer the question, was pink originally a boy's color? For a brief moment in the early 20th century, some people suggested it was. They had their reasons. But this was a small part of a much bigger, constantly changing story. The idea that any color belongs to a specific gender is a relatively modern concept. And it's one that many people are now ready to move beyond. Colors should be for everyone to enjoy. They should not be used to put people into boxes.